Good afternoon and good morning, everyone. We're beginning our webinar from the U.S. Copyright Office, Hip Hop Beyond 50, Protecting and Promoting Culture. I'm so thrilled to welcome you to this event today. Hip hop is a uniquely American art form rooted in African American culture, and it marked its official 50th anniversary in 2023. The Copyright Office is the part of the US government tasked with administering the copyright system, and of course, being aware of what's going on in the arts and cultural and innovation communities. Today, during this webinar, we're going to be introducing you to a number of panelists from both inside the Copyright Office and out in the community. I'll invite you to participate with questions that we'll handle at the end of the session by using the Q&A function that you see in the webinar and by clicking on the caption button if you would like caption. At a high level, I just want to acknowledge that February is Black History Month. This year's theme is African Americans in the Arts. What a perfect theme to kick off this particular webinar. And I'd like to break and introduce my colleague, John Riley. John Riley will be giving us some opening remarks about the context of the law and copyright in music and hip hop. And then with less ado, we'll pass it on to the rest of our staff to be able to introduce our panelists. So thank you again for joining us here today. We're joined by lots of different people from all over the place, and we're looking forward to providing this to you both live and then as a follow-on recorded on our website for future use. So with no further ado, my name is Miriam Lord. Welcome to the U.S. Copyright Office. This is John Riley. Take it away, John.
Thanks, Miriam. Hi, everybody. I'm an assistant general counsel at the U.S. Copyright Office, and I love hip hop. For my 10th birthday, my parents got me concert tickets to see who was then my favorite performer, MC Hammer. I went to the show with the coolest mom on the planet and my two best friends, and I still know every word to You Can't Touch This. My father, however, insisted that Hammer stole the music for the song because he had recognized that the music for You Can't Touch This came from James' 1981 song, Super Freak. But under the law, was he right? Today, I'm going to start by talking a little bit about why copyright law is important to hip hop, but also how hip hop has been important to copyright law. From its beginnings, hip hop music has relied on sampling and interpolation. Sampling involves taking part of an existing sound recording and incorporating it into a new work. And interpolation involves taking part of an existing musical work, that is a song's underlying composition, along with any lyrics, and incorporating that musical work into a new work. So songs like James Brown's Funky Drummer and the Winstons' Amen Brother have each been sampled thousands of times, with early hip hop music sampling heavily from funk, disco, and R&B. The practice of using pre-existing music in hip hop has, of course, raised some copyright questions and has led to important copyright precedent. So, for example, in Bridgeport Music versus Dimension Films, the Sixth Circuit was asked to address the use of a sample of a song by George Clinton and the Funkadelics in NWA's song 100 Miles and Runnin'. So an issue there was whether the alleged copying of the song through the sample violated copyright, or whether it was considered de minimis. Basically, was the sample too trivial to be considered copyright infringement? So in its decision, the court first recognized that the copyright laws attempt to strike a balance between protecting original works and stifling further creativity. But it also noted that advances in technology, coupled with the advent of the popularity of hip hop or rap music, had made instances of digital sampling extremely common and have spawned a plethora of copyright disputes and litigation. Ultimately, the court determined that a sound recording owner has the exclusive right to, quote, sample his own recording. And in sum, the court's advice was, quote, get a license or do not sample, end quote. So the court seemingly understood that its determination would be controversial, as it stated that many of the hip hop artists may view this rule as stifling creativity, but noted, among some other practical considerations, that today's sampler is tomorrow's samplee. So that prediction has come true, as NWA's song 100 Miles and Runnin' has itself been sampled in Ice Cube, Tupac, and Public Enemy songs. So in practice, because many samples and interpolations will infringe a copyright owner's exclusive rights, licensing those uses is now the norm, unless the use is considered a fair use. So fair use is a legal offense that promotes freedom of expression by permitting the unlicensed use of copyright protected works in certain circumstances. When a court determines whether a use is a fair one, it will evaluate at least the following 4 factors: the purpose and character of the use, including whether such use is of a commercial nature or is for nonprofit educational purposes, the nature of the copyrighted work, the amount and substantiality of the portion used in relation to the copyrighted work as a whole, and the effect of the use upon the potential market or value of the copyrighted work. Interestingly, one of the most important Supreme Court cases addressing fair use is Campbell versus A Cup of Music. Excuse me. That case involved Two Live Crew's commercial parody of Roy Orbison's song "Oh Pretty Woman." A lower court had ruled that the Two Live Crew song parody was not fair use, and that its commercial nature was basically determinative. One second. Of the question of whether the use was fair. So the Supreme Court reversed that decision, stating that you can't give virtually dispositive weight to the commercial nature of parodies. And it explained that because parodies comment on another author's work, the parody must use some of the elements of that earlier work. So looking at the songs at issue, the court said that Two Live Crew just supposes the romantic musings of a man whose fantasies come true with the degrading taunts, a bawdy demand for sex, and a sigh of relief from paternal responsibility. The later words can be taken as a comment on the naivete of the original of an earlier day, as a rejection of its sentiment that ignores the ugliness of street life and the debasement it signifies. In short, the court recognized that Two Live Crew's song needed to use some of Orbison's song to engage in social commentary or criticism, and the commercial nature of the Two Live Crew song wasn't dispositive to the fair use determination. So the case is one of the most important fair use cases in copyright. It's taught in law schools across the country and has been cited in nearly 800 other determinations. And it all stemmed from a dispute over a rap song. I have to mention, interestingly enough, today, this isn't the only time hip hop has made it to the Supreme Court. Earlier today, the Supreme Court heard oral arguments for a case involving the Copyright Act statute of limitations, but the case's background actually involves the alleged interpolation of a song from 1984 by a 2008 Flo Rida song in the air. So with only a couple of examples, it's clear that hip hop has helped shape the court's interpretation of the copyright laws. And those decisions have in turn helped clarify the expectations about using pre-existing works in music today. So with that context, I'm going to hand it over to my friend and colleague, Jalise Mangum, for some additional conversations about promoting and protecting the culture of hip hop.
Thank you so much, John. Thank you for a great intro into the discussion about promoting and protecting hip hop culture. My name is Jalise Mangum. I'm an attorney in the Office of General Counsel here at the Copyright Office. We've got a great lineup of panelists here, experts in the culture and in the industry. So I'll jump right in to introducing them. First up is Day Bogan. Mr. Day is a music rights expert, entrepreneur, author, and artist rights advocate with over 15 years of experience in the music industry. He was a Billboard 2019 Digital Power Players honoree and currently serves as the head of third-party partnerships at the MLC, the Mechanical Licensing Collective, where he leads the MLC strategy of engaging third-party entities that provide support to creators and publishers in the areas of rights administration, data management, operations, and education. Hello, Day. Next, we have Bruce Waynne of the legendary MIDI Mafia. He is a Grammy Award-winning producer and writer known for writing and producing hits such as 50 Cent's 21 Questions, Frank Ocean's Swim Good and Bad Religion, and Fantasia Monique Barrino's When I See You, which we've discussed is one of my personal favorites. He has over 20 years of experience in the music industry, working at the intersection of entertainment and technology, and he currently serves on the MLC's Unclaimed Royalties Oversight Committee. Welcome, Bruce. I'm also pleased to welcome Jamila Sams. She is an educator with over 20 years of experience working with youth of all ages and backgrounds. She is the mastermind behind We Do It for the Culture curriculum, a culturally responsive social emotional learning curriculum grounded in hip hop culture for grades 6 through 12. Ms. Sams is also a proud native of Philly and a hip hop head. Hi, Jamila. Next, last but not least, we have Junious Brickhouse. He is an award-winning urban dance educator, choreographer, community leader, and cultural preservationist dedicated to the authentic preservation of urban dance culture and community. He wears many hats as the director of the org Next Level and founder and executive director of Urban Artistry, Inc. He is also currently serving as the co-chair of the American Folklore Society's Cultural Diversity Committee and as a board member for the National Council for the Traditional Arts. Welcome, Junious. Welcome to all of our panelists. Thank you so much for your presence here today. So I want to jump in, and I've warned the panelists already about this very corny first question, but my brown sugar fans will understand the reference. I want to start with just a brief introduction. When did you first fall in love with hip hop? Really, what led you to make this your life's work? Let's start with Ms. Sams.
So I really feel as though hip hop is literally in my DNA. When I was growing up, my father is from Harlem, but he opened up what's called a corner store, or in New York, they would call it a bodega, in West Philadelphia. That was right by West Philadelphia High School. And students would literally come over to his store and just engage and buy, fat shoestrings and penny candy and anything else that was related to hip hop culture in the 80s. But he used hip hop in order to engage his customers. So I literally was about maybe 5 years old, going to visit in the store, and I was just kind of submerged into hip hop culture at a very early age, and it's been with me and a part of me ever since.
Awesome. Thank you so much. How about Bruce?
Wow, that's an interesting question. Kind of like, I would say like Jamila, like I don't think it was a specific day or time. It's just life, just culturally, I'm from Brooklyn. I'm from East New York, Brooklyn. So like, if I think you know what, I fell in love with it with Video Music Box with Ralph McDaniel. And he was like, I forgot what they call it. It was like, it wasn't cable, but it was like cable, like it wasn't cable. Anyway, when I started to see the people that I see every day in the streets, from the clothes, the jewelry, the cars and everything, and then I'm actually watching a video with it, I was like, wait a minute, there's something going on here. And I was like, that's me. So I could say maybe like 14 is when I just like, this is what it is. And then I just started, between radio at the time, I was about to say streaming, right? Like between radio at the time and just looking for it, finding out, just like, wait, like just connecting the dots, like 14, because that was the time I could kind of really do stuff. High school started, you got to look fresh, got to get the fat shoelaces, all of that. I was probably going to Jamila's father's store, whatever it was, so I'll say like 14, 13 when I became like clear, conscious of it.
That's really interesting. Look, you were born in it, but then you didn't realize it was like really a thing until like you became sort of your own person. How about you, Junious?
And this is one of my favorite questions. Like, and my background. Originally, I'm from Norfolk, Virginia. So unlike Bruce, my exposure to what was rap music at the time and wasn't presented to us as a culture, right?
Okay.
I didn't dig it too much, like, in 80, 81, I'm a little bit older, like, so, the music didn't speak to me. We had, Earth, Wind and Fire, we had James Brown, we had funk music, so that was what I grew up in as a dancer. So I grew up doing, popping and Campbell locking and when breaking became a thing, in Virginia, it was kind of like an awakening for me, because then as a dancer, I understood that there was something culturally. So I say to people all the time that, you know, hip hop, like as a culture, was a choice. You know, it was
Okay.
me recognizing there was so much that was coming out of Black and brown communities that was worth taking the time to understand and to study, and see what contributions I could make as an artist. So, but if there's a moment where the music changed, and I gotta say this because like the first rap songs you listen to, like The Message, you know, you listen to that. I didn't know people who spoke like that. I didn't know people in radio, you know, I didn't know people like on television. So the fact that there were people rapping or rhyming like in a voice that didn't connect with me, that didn't use the slang that I use, I thought it was a little bit strange, you know. But when the music started using the samples that I recognize with funk music, yeah, they had me. They had me. Then I knew it was time to click in. And also when, you know, the dance music, like when it became dance music, I would say when Planet Rock hit, that was a moment. And when Rakim said enough biting it'll make you choke, you can't provoke, you can't cope, you should have broke, because I ain't no joke. I knew that there was a new way of messaging about how I felt about music, how I felt about dance. So yeah, that's a long answer for a very layered question, but I think across the United States, if you ask people in small town USA, you're gonna get all different types of answers to that wonderful question. So thank you for asking it.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad we got some bars in here. Perfect. How about you, Day? When did you fall in love with hip hop? When did you want to make it your life's work?
So I'm glad Junious went first because, similar, it wasn't, I wouldn't say I fell in love with hip hop, but I was exposed to hip hop and appreciated hip hop. My interest was around R&B and soul. And, like what Junior said, when you started getting collaborations, when you started getting R&B and soul hooks, that, which I'm going to speak to I guess we'll get to this eventually, but how hip hop draws in other audiences, right? Using samples, using collaboration. So, hip hop starting as a form, rap, and basically on the East Coast, you're going to have this growth over time that draws in other communities, not only because the message is about Black folks and our struggles, but because the entertainment aspect of it starts to draw in other listeners. So for me, I actually grew up in the music industry. My father was a Cleveland area music entrepreneur. I knew what a record label was and a publisher was when I was in middle school, signing other artists. So, my dad had an artist management company. He managed R&B groups and hip hop groups, and he had a concert hall. I mean, all the 80s and 90s artists, performed in Cleveland, came to this concert hall. So as a kid, I was around artists. So I was around music. And my family's very musical. My cousin is young Yanni, who's a hip hop producer. And I have another cousin, Durant Bernard, who's an R&B, it's neo soul singer. And I have another cousin who's, live music production for Earth, Wind and Fire, Barry Manilow. So we have a musical family. So I appreciated multiple genres of music. Hip hop was one that my brothers gravitated to, while I gravitated more to R&B. But once we started getting more R&B hip hop blends in the 90s, and that's when it was like, oh, this is something I can participate in too, even though I'm not a rapper. Or I didn't want to mimic a rapper, because a lot of kids want to mimic rappers. Well, I wanted to mimic R&B singers. So I think as hip hop evolved from its entertainment component, that's where I started to really gravitate to more hip hop artists. Started actually buying my first hip hop CDs and listening to melodic hip hop, things that are that diverged from its origins. So And then you mentioned dance music, and now we have so many derivatives of hip hop, 50 years later. And I get this now be in a space in my life's work where I'm contributing to artists who are making music in these derivative spaces and these subgenres that all come from hip hop as an origination. That's where I sort of shine now, but it definitely wasn't in the very beginning in the late 80s, early 90s when I was a kid, but I think it evolved in my adolescence as hip hop evolved from a content creation standpoint.
That's amazing. It really is sort of like a tree, like all kind of culture. It develops and it builds upon everything else and kind of speaks to the development of Black culture and generally just like us using what we have to build something new that continues to be new as time goes on. So I want to pivot a bit to hip hop and copyright. Bruce and Junious, you are our creators on the panel. And I want to ask, as artists, when did you come to understand the importance of protecting what you were creating? When did you feel empowered to do so? As we start this discussion about promoting, but also protecting your work. You start with Bruce.
A very interesting question. My very first record that came out commercially was 21 Questions, right?
Mm-hmm.
Me and my partner, we were in business for not even a year, but our energies were really good. And he's from Canada, Ottawa, Canada. I'm from Brooklyn. People just didn't even see why we even got along, but it was like we're from different places, but we just like the same person. And our relationship really connected. So I think when that connected, everything just started to connect. And then and 50 Cent gave us the opportunity. And we sampled Barry White song. I know why it's slipping me right now. A little chop of it, but he was dying. So his wife, she charged us a lot of money, man, like a lot of money. And I had to literally call her and be like, hey, like, this is kind of ridiculous, like what you're trying to charge and what you want to take and what you want to do, whatever. And then she said, well, you may know Barry White is a successful musician. He's doing this, he's doing that, but we got medical bills. We have this, we have that, we have this. The royalties don't come in as fast as you think they are. Da-da-da. She started really breaking it down to me from a human perspective. And that's when it was like, give him whatever he wants, right? Because if we didn't chop that little chop, we wouldn't have that song. You know what I mean? So it made me realize like, oh, at some point, someone's going to be sampling me. And what if I'm in that kind of situation? That's what something really connect me of livelihood. And then when you look now, I think like LL Cool J just sampled me for When I See You. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. So it's like, once we did that, and I'm glad it was my first record. I'm glad it wasn't a situation where it was like, 5-10 records down the line when we had that kind of situation. I'm glad it happened in the very beginning because it just changed my thought process and just music on, oh, I'm paying homage to somebody. Let me make sure they get taken care of. But also too, in every situation, I learned more on what I need to do. So I was kind of like learning in real time. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that really does make sense. You kind of realize the importance of like protecting yourself by encountering somebody else who is protecting their work.
Well, it's not like the music industry has a 401k sitting on the side for you, right? It's not like, it's not like you got to take the money you make and go set that stuff up and go get a Roth. It's not like, a corporation been working for 25 years. So, you have to, just like any business, you got to put things in place to make sure you're protected. And it's about legacy. So that's what this is really about.
Wow. That's important. What about you, Junious, as a dancer? When did you come to realize the importance of protecting what you were creating, your choreography, your movement?
Yeah, so I think for me, it was motivated by what I was seeing happening in the music industry. The music the music drives it. it's an inspiration, and the music's not right. The movement, the dance cultures and communities, like they fall back, or in some cases suffer. People aren't as creative, and for us as dancers, like the number one rule is don't bite. You have to be authentic. It has to come like from a true place, what you're creating. So I grew up as a street dancer in the 80s, where um, you just didn't copy people. And what I took from that as a child was that what I was doing with this street dance stuff is that I had to be responsible in that. When we started performing outside of basketball courts and rec centers, like when we started to actually and talent shows and get booked for things, that's when things changed. Like then it was like, okay, so when I create something for the stage, am I doing the right things? Am I remembering, do I know what performing rights is? Do I know what it means to respect the music that I'm using? Because we weren't creators, we weren't, music makers. So we were always using music. So what were the laws behind that, and how we do that? Because we knew that, people were starting to run into legal issues with sampling. So what did it mean when I was doing a show and I was using tracks and I didn't have licenses for? It was a wake-up call as an adult, knowing that all of my hard work, would be ruined because I didn't follow the same principles that that I had in my community, which is like, respect people's things don't belong to you, and acknowledge where you got it from. And yes, sometimes you have to pay people, to be in community. So for me, it's always been something that understanding to, protect what it is that I do. Like it's not really about me, right? It's or about the work or how I make money. It's about how we all sustain in hip hop culture. And it's a network. And I think most of the people here understand that it's not just, teaching dancers that, it's not just about how creative you are. It's about the music that you're using and how you credit people and how you license properly when you are making money, that makes us not just responsible, but also authentically kind. Yeah.
That's really amazing, because I think for so many people, it is about protecting themselves, but your thought, and even Bruce, your thought is also just in general protecting the culture and making sure, as the kids say, we all eat. So I think that's really important. Day, you've worked with artists in artist representation for years and years and years. What do you see as the most significant challenge? A part of what Bruce and Junious talked about was this sort of educational hump they came to learn about what these different concepts were, what rights were, what licensing was. What do you see as the challenge in educating artists on how to receive the value of their work, and also make sure they are making sure everyone else is compensated?
Yeah, over the last, I guess, this is 2024, so I guess it's been, 18 years since 2006. I've been working with DJs, then dancers, eventually break dancers, and then hip hop artists, MCs. So, 3 of the 5 elements of hip hop I've been managing as a manager and advising career and growth and strategy for these creators. And my first exposure to, I think to kind of go back to what Waynne, what Bruce Waynne has said is sort of trying to create while also trying to respect, other people's creation. Was my first encounter with that was when I managed a DJ, a mashup DJ, who's a award-winning DJ, turntablist, and we put out a mixtape. Well, he put out a 1 hour long mashup set, and we had all these samples on it. I think it was like over 70 different samples, and wanted to put it out, and we got a cease and desist from one of the publishers behind one of the samples, and from him as a DJ, his art is samples, right? That's literally the art of a DJ is blending samples and putting that out. But obviously, it's not possible for a DJ to clear every sample in a 1 hour mix set, which led me to explore more of that space. And between that and some work with some artists led me to really dive deeper into the music rights space at the intersection of technology. And there was a company called Dubset that I launched to help DJs clear samples in their mix sets and their mashups. And I was very interested in that, and it was a part of sort of the PR launch of talking about why that's so important, not only to creators like DJs, but to the artists who create, whose music is being sampled. Trying to create an ecosystem and a solution so that everyone eats without trampling on anyone's creativity, the DJ's creativity and the original artist's creativity. So that's kind of what sort of teed me up to where I am now, 15 years later at MLC, building solutions and resources so that creators are properly compensated and also credited. Per Junious is making sure to get credited. So there's been a lot of different sort of eras in my 18 years of working with creators, and what has led me to really is this notion that I'm on the one hand, I'm a copyright purist, but I'm also a creator advocate, which sometimes comes to a conflict, because a creative advocate is that, well, any creative output should be protected, even if that creative output is the use of someone else's creation, but in a way that respects it, which is where the licensing comes into play and crediting comes into play and remuneration. So there's a way to meet both those needs. And that's why I like the work that I do now, helping to make those needs possible.
For you, Bruce, Junious, if I were an artist just starting out, where should I start to educate myself? Because I think kind of you probably know, Day, artists coming into this, they are artists, they're creators, they care about the movement, they care about the music. They don't necessarily know all of the legal jargon, and it can be really intimidating kind of entering this space. So where should one start if they were an artist first coming in to understanding how to protect?
So, I think it starts with I think the industry as a whole has to have a sense of compassion, and knowing that there's a gap, right? There's a knowledge gap between the moment you become creative and the moment that you can monetize that creation at scale. There's a huge gap in terms of resources that you have access to, motivation to even have to learn, to get the knowledge, because some people are simply not motivated because they're not getting paid. If you're not making enough money, why are you motivated to invest into education? So that is something that as an educator at UCLA, I'm talking to music students, I'm talking to other types of students who want to work in the music industry, but they're paying tens of thousands of dollars to learn about this. If you're a hip hop artist in Cleveland, making beats in your living room, or your bedroom, you're 17 years old, and that blows up on the internet, and all of a sudden, a record label is coming to you, and your mom doesn't know anything about the business, and you sign a record deal, giving away all your rights. That happens all the time, right? When I own Tune Registry, I dealt with a lot of those type of artists who simply don't have the knowledge, but sometimes, the train can move faster than they expect. And, we have to have sort of compassion, and that comes with making sure deals are fair, right? At the distributor level, deals are fair. At the publisher and a record label level, deals are fair, and that you're compassionate, knowing that you're not taking advantage of an artist who doesn't know anything. Because so many artists sign deals. I've managed artists who had crappy deals, and they didn't know anything. Now they learn later, but the later part is often too late. So I think that the industry has to have some compassion. Then organizations have to do their part, and a lot of organizations do their part. At the MLC, for example, we have a ton of educational resources. We have a head of educational partnerships, Serona Elton, who engages with universities across the country to educate educators. We educate professors to educate their students. We have student ambassadors to talk about music rights and copyright and publishing. And I do tons of workshops, but that's still not enough because we're one organization. There's a lot of, the industry has to have a sense of compassion, and individual companies have to have a sense of compassion. That really comes in the deal making, knowing that you're sitting across from someone who doesn't know anything, and taking advantage of that fact is unfair.
That's super true. Bruce, where did you start in this journey of educating yourself? Did you use your attorneys? Like, did you just?
Nah, made a lot of mistakes.
Yeah.
I mean, real talk, I don't, like I said, like, there's the cultural side of it, right? And then there's the corporate side of it, and they don't connect, So the corporate side was mandated by laws to be like, hey, before you sign somebody, you need to do this, and then you can sign somebody. Then I think things will change because they would have to educate. That person would go, what is this? And they'll go, okay, well, you need to go talk to this person before you do anything, right? So it's not like that. And I don't think, but I think that also takes a lot away from what we get, right? That takes a lot. This is why the music is the way it is. You know what I'm saying? It's like a heavy balancing act. There's really nowhere. There's a lot of places to go, but you don't have access to know where to go to get the information. Then when you get the information, there's so much information. They just like, I don't want to deal with this. I just want to make the music. So it's just really weird. I think though with technology, like what Day is doing, and it feels like now the culture is more respected as like a real business. Like, like you said, these kids going to school that are like, yo, I'm going to be a manager and I'm going to get a hip hop artist. I'm going to get this. I'm going to blow this up. They don't know that. I'm going to know this. This is why we're going to get together. Like, or, what LeBron's doing, like he got all his friends, they all educated, they all getting money. They handle certain parts of the business and they're qualified to do it. You know what I mean? So I think, I don't think there's a straightforward answer with that,
Yeah.
Because, you wouldn't get certain artists if they didn't go through what they went through. You would not have Dr. Dre if he didn't go through what he went through. It's just what it is. You know what I'm saying? If it was like he was educated all the way through, I don't think he would have signed Eminem, and then Eminem would have signed 50, and then you would have had Bruce Wayne on here. Like I don't know. So I'm kind of torn with that question because I can't say there isn't information out there. I can't say that there aren't people who are doing the right thing, that are advocating, that are going hard. There's also the other side of it. And like I said, there's not a straightforward answer with that. And I'm not gonna just make it up. I'm just want to be as honest and as clear as possible.
Absolutely. Yeah, the I think there are like organizations now doing the work to educate people. The Copyright Office does have materials in which my colleague Ashley Tucker is dropping in the chat for people to go look at. But a part of what you mentioned is sort of the anti-establishment nature of hip hop. And there can be sort of a tension between protecting what you're doing, but also promoting. Hip hop is a really generous culture generally, you know, with the development of mixtape sampling. We're really generous about wanting to share our stories, but the protection element is often missed. How do you navigate doing both, getting the viral moment, but making sure you're compensated, especially in this digital era? Like, what does that look like as an artist, as someone who's hoping to protect artists?
Is that a question for me?
It could be for anyone.
Well, I think to jump into it real quick, to give you a different kind of perspective. If, like Day said, if I'm 17 years old and I get a viral hit and I made this song in my you know, bedroom, my moms don't know too much about the business, and I signed this deal, what happens is that somewhere along that chain, that person gets smart and go, wait a minute, you know, oh, I'm not getting the money I'm supposed to get. And then they monetize everything else. They take advantage of that one moment. They monetize everything else, and they do. You want to pay me for a show? You want to pay me 10,000? Nah, I'm not doing a show unless you give me 50. Because they're realizing they're not making the money on the other side. And then they get themselves to a point where it gets so hot, then the label is like, hey, I need you to drop another project. They be like, nah, you need to give me what you should have gave me last time. You know, so what's happening is that the entrepreneurial spirit is there, you know, and because once you get in the mix, you learn very quickly because you're around other artists. They start talking, they start sharing information. They're like, wait, why I don't got this? Why I don't got that? Why I don't got this? And that's why you get those artists that they look like they don't care or whatever, but they just all about the money, you know? So they make it in another way and get their life right, and then come back and then do it the right way. And then they pass that information and they start their own record labels. They start their own businesses and start signing their friends. So then what happens is that it gets very, you know, cliquish. It gets very cliquish, you know?
Yeah.
So there's a culture inside of a culture inside of another culture. So like, I'm just trying to give you another perspective on it. You know what I mean? You know?
Yeah, that's interesting. Day, did you have thoughts from like a representation?
They've set in on a Day Bogan workshop. Because I have at this point, you know, I have communicated with hundreds of what I call, you know, early mid-career artists. These are artists that are getting millions of streams, millions of downloads, you know, but still don't. I mean, you know, their fans might think they have all their I's dotted and T's crossed, but they don't. And they're still learning. And I think as a culture, you mentioned something, Jaleesa, which I agree with. I actually talked about this in a piece a couple of years ago. There is this. It's not as much as it used to be, I guess, when I started representing artists, but there was definitely this gap, this anti-establishment gap of, you know, who is this organization that I need to go and sign up with? I'm not giving them my information. You want my what? My ID, my text information? I'm not giving you that. You know, and because there was this huge knowledge gap. Internet was obviously helpful because everything's on the internet now. You can just search something. Before people meet with me, by the time they met with me, they've already searched me or searched for the MLC or some of the other projects I'm working on, and have a little bit of knowledge, but there's still a huge gap with some artists that, you know, the fans would think have everything together, but you know, and that's where the labels, that's why I say it goes back to labels and publishers, because if you were inspired to educate your roster, like when I had my management company, I did workshops with my team. My the artists that we manage, I broke down the provisions of the contracts. We did workshops on closed composition clauses. So we did workshops on publishing. So by the time I closed down my label, my publishing company, I was able to just hand them over the masters and they were able to run with it. Now that's different from a small, independent, tiny little label, but major labels, major publishers, and major independent labels and publishers, that sense of compassion, educating your roster so that they know, so that they're great in their careers. When you're a chef, when you're a Michelin star chef, you were educated on how to be the best chef. Being the best artist is not just talent anymore. It's also the best entrepreneur, because that's where longevity comes into play. So that element has to be a part of it.
Absolutely.
And,
Speaking of,
Jalise, I'm sorry. Jalise, I wanted to add something to what Jay and Bruce Waynne were saying. From a dancer's perspective, one of the things that we're encouraging at Next Level is just that part about performing rights and working to be a lot more responsible with what we're doing with music. But at the same time, from a dancer's perspective, one thing that I'm also trying to teach artists is from the perspective of cultural heritage, right? If you look at hip hop and you think about it as a culture and how we pass it down, that doesn't mean you can't monetize, and I think there's that hiccup that people think that when you say culture, it means for free. And that's not necessarily the case. And I feel like we should do, as artists, do a lot more research about what came before us and look at how people have been taken advantage of, and even some forms erased from a movement perspective. The old buck dancers, which would become tap dancers, a lot of their works and their methods of teaching and their choreography was never documented properly. And so therefore, we don't know about them. We don't know what they're doing. And I think when I get into this box where it's like, hey, how do I sustain? I got bills to pay. How do I create art so that I can make money? I stop for a second and I go back and I reflect on the people who have built, this platform that I'm using, right? Because, let's be honest, there are a few of us can actually say we created a thing. We are doing movement that's been passed down to us in the way that we line it up, the way that we choreograph it, the way that we document it might be specific to our experience, but at the same time, in its core, it's a part of African American heritage. So I think going back and get it, not to invoke Sankofa, but understanding how we got to this present moment before we decide how much money we want to make, and how big of an artist we can be, how famous we can be. We could do a little bit more reflection on the people who came before us and who didn't have it as easy as we did.
That's really important. Kind of thinking about that educational piece. Jamila, you use hip hop not as a sample, but in your curriculum to teach students social emotional intelligence. Can you speak to how students respond to that and how you use the elements of hip hop as educational tools?
Sure. So when I think about the culture, no culture would exist without our collective stories and our collective experiences. And for a lot of the students that are in schools all throughout America, oftentimes just their presence is going against the grain. And so I think it's really important for us to have opportunities for students to be their authentic selves and share their stories. And that's literally what hip hop came to be, out of a really important need for people that were being marginalized to share their stories and their experiences. And so we use that hip hop as an art form and all the elements within hip hop as an art form in order for students to express themselves in school. A lot of students have a lot of great things to celebrate, but a lot of our students are also, experiencing emotions that are tied to trauma and other things that they've been through in life. And hip hop has always kind of been that art form where they're able to express themselves in a creative way, in a safe way, in order to get their voices heard. And so we leverage content that does exist through various platforms, and we connect that content to the 5 social emotional learning competencies. And those really speak directly to a lot of the elements of hip hop. So when you think about self-awareness, which is the first social emotional learning competency, that speaks directly to the 5th element of hip hop, which is knowledge of self. And all the other elements really can't even exist without that element. And so we think about it the same way with students. In order for them to know who they are and whose they are, they have to practice that reflection. And we think about self-management, which is the 2nd SEL competency. We think about hip hop, like in order for students to manage their emotions, they need to channel it in some way. And obviously we want them to channel it in a positive way. And so hip hop is also an opportunity for students, whether it's through breaking or dance or, spoken word, like that is a way for them to manage their emotions. The rest of the competencies as it pertains to like social awareness, I mean, what greater tool than hip hop to use in order to talk about things that are happening in our communities, not just, in our communities, but the nation and globally. Then you have relationship skills to speak directly to. The first thing that comes to my mind is the DJ, right? Like I've been to plenty of parties where the DJ did not move the crowd. That means they were not practicing positive relationship skills. And so we leverage those 5 SEL competencies, the 5th one being responsible decision-making, and we tie it to hip hop because hip hop, when I think about responsible decision-making, has always been in its natural state. That's what it was designed to do in order to share our stories and to educate the masses so that we can make, responsible decisions that, transcend generations. So we try to make sure that their stories are being centered and students kind of see themselves in the content.
That's amazing and such important work. Thank you for doing that. The youth are the future. And as we talk about like the future, I want to get into beyond hip hop before we get into the Q&A, beyond 50 years, before we get into the Q&A. Hip hop did turn 50 last year. So this being year 51, how do you see hip hop culture evolving and how might copyright impact that evolution? And I'm thinking about artificial intelligence, AI, the continued boom of tech. What do you see hip hop being in the future in the next 50 years?
Well, I'll just speak a little bit to that. Innovation and kind of looking to the future of the music industry is something that, I enjoy, I occupy myself with a lot. I mean, we already see it, right? We're 50 years into hip hop and it has transformed and transcended beyond what the originators had intended. And it shows up in fashion, in art, and we talk about the 5 elements of hip hop, but there's now many applications of hip hop, education, curriculums, design, architecture. So there's so many applications that's supposed to reflect or represent hip hop that goes beyond the 5 elements that we say is the origination of hip hop. Now, from a social political standpoint, hip hop has been used globally as a way for the underrepresented and the marginalized to have a voice, whether it's through performance art or through the way in which messages are presented. Like I said before, I'm here in Latin America doing outreach, and I see hip hop show up all over the city of Medellin, in Spanish, through reggaeton, but also in English, with hip hop artists being played in the barrios in the hills of Medellin, with graffiti art, with Black Lives Matter murals and 5 elements of hip hop murals in Comuna 13. And with kids from these neighborhoods learning to breakdance, performing in the streets for money, rapping with a speaker, with a boombox, literally walking down the street with you, rapping along side you to try to get your attention, try to obviously make money, instead of things that could get them in trouble, right? So they're using hip hop, elements of hip hop, breakdancing, emceeing, DJing, graffiti art. I don't see much beatboxing down here, but so we see that hip hop has transcended its original form, and the message is still there, though. It still resonates with people who need an outlet to express what they're going through in life, and to often it often shows up still as a counterculture, even at its highest and most expensive form. And it still shows up as counter to whatever is the mainstream within that industry. Whether it's a collaboration with a high-end fashion designer and a hip hop artist, it still shows up as counter to what you would normally see on the runway. So hip hop, I think, at all levels represents still a sort of a upward mobility of a message to the broader or more mainstream audiences within the context of that use, and often represents the most underserved creatives in those spaces, even though those creatives may be financially well off. But they're to their counterparts and their peers. If you look at the context of it, it still serves as a so I think a counter or kind of a progressive movement.
Continued progression. I believe. Oh, Bruce.
To add on to what Dave's saying, I think hip hop is going to continue to be the case study, for a lot of what's going on with laws, because the music is pumped out so fast, and we're the early adopter. Hip hop is an early adopter with technology, so I feel that like everything's going on with AI, whatever's going on with blockchain, what's going on with just whatever iteration is about to come, hip hop is always going to be at the forefront of it, because these kids in the computers, they always have to have access to everything. So they're always going to try what's going on. Like, for example, there's this platform called Even, right? It's like, I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's like, it's allowing artists to now like, say, forget the record labels, just buy from me direct. But what's cool about it is that this isn't a new concept, but they're educating everybody at the same time. They're educating the consumer at the same time. They're saying like, hey, if we were to listen to this song on Spotify this amount of times, they're gonna make, $2. If you do this, they can make $20. Don't you want to support? So what's happening is that people that are really fans, when they're investing, they pay what they want, and they know that artist is making. They know that they're really supporting their artists versus using what else is out there. So then now it's changed. But what's happening now, the record labels are starting to use Even. It's weird, right? So what's happening is that that's just a case study as to like, do fans really support their artists? Or there's more alternative ways now to release your music. You don't have to go through the big three. So these are case studies, and we're using it. We're seeing it's allowing us to see the mindset of the consumer, but most of the consumers are also the people that are creating. We're in a creative economy now. Creative economy now, right? So in regards to the copyright law, same thing. There's going to be a lot more new things that never existed before, and it's going to be a hip hop record. It's
Yeah,
not gonna be an R&B record. It's not gonna be a country song. Not gonna be, you know, it's not gonna be, it's not even gonna be like, reggaeton. It's gonna be a rap record out of the hood. Somebody who's just doing whatever they got to do to make it happen to change their life, and they're using hip hop to do it. And
right.
that's going to create those case studies. You know what I'm saying? So I think that's what the next 50 is going to be about. And then eventually we'll start defining a lot of what it's going to be. You know?
Right. Well, I look forward to it. I think we have time for like one question maybe, because our conversation kind of went long. It was really interesting. But John, you have that question?
Yeah, I think we got a couple of questions about if there's a minimum amount of music you could take in a sample and have it be non-infringing. I love all the discussion today, especially about education, because everybody seems to agree that that is super important to people. We can't give legal advice, but we could give some top level advice. No, there is no minimum. That is one of the great copyright myths. You can argue de minimis use, you could argue fair use, but that is something that a court will decide. And it's always safer to get a license, especially when you're taking sound recordings and things like that. I would suggest that folks continue their education discussions, whether it's with people on this great call or at local volunteer lawyers for the arts organizations. But education seems to be really important. So I appreciate that part of the discussion today.
Any other questions? Well, I think that is our time. I mean, I really have to thank our panelists for your presence, for your expertise, for your willingness to share stories too. That was really important, and I hope it was edifying for our audience. So we are grateful for your participation. We're also super grateful to the attendees who signed up and came in and asked questions. We are also grateful for your presence. The office will continue to stay engaged. Please check out the links that Ashley put in the chat. They're super helpful. And the office seeks to be a place where people can come and educate themselves. So definitely use our resources, use the Office of Public Information and Education. And until next time, thank you so much for attending.